it was over. All of it, in a moment, gone. Everything that they had built together, everything that they had done together. And look where it got them. None of the disciples ever expected that this was going to be the outcome of 3 years spent with Jesus. Betrayed by one of their own, their master taken in the middle of the night, put on trial for trumped-up charges and downright lies. The same people who less than a week ago, had shouted at him, "Hosanna! Hosanna in the highest!" We're now shouting, "Give us Barabbas." Choosing to let a known and convicted killer back into their midst so that they could kill someone who never did anything wrong. The worst thing he'd ever done was make a few religious leaders and Pharisees uncomfortable. And yet they were choosing to make this happen. All of them had the same thought. This can't possibly be real. He's gonna say something, he's gonna do something, and all this is gonna go away. It's all gonna end. But he didn't. The real sobering moment for the 11 remaining disciples that were there amongst the crowd was when the crowd stopped chanting for Barabbas and started chanting words that sent a cold shiver down their spines. Crucify him. It didn't make any sense. Nothing Jesus ever did was worthy of any sort of an arrest, let alone the death penalty, and let alone crucifixion. They couldn't understand what was happening. They tried everything they could to piece this whole thing together. How could the crowd call for this sort of thing? All Jesus ever did was try to help people everywhere that he went. He brought healing, not just physical healing, but emotional and certainly spiritual healing every place that they ever went with him. Chances are good that a lot of members of this crowd that's chanting for him to be crucified had maybe been healed by him themselves, or at the very least they knew of somebody, a friend, a neighbor, maybe even a relative who'd been touched by Jesus, whether by his actual hands or by his words. How fickle could these people be? And yet here they were, calling for Jesus to be killed in the most degrading and humiliating and painful of ways that humanity had come up with to this point. As the coward politician Pilate washed his hands of this whole ordeal, the disciples watched in horror at everything that took place right in front of them. With every lash of the whip, every thud of the guard's strikes, every crack of the rods against the body of Jesus, it caused them to weep even deeper and harder than they had before. Every disciple had the same instinct to go and to throw themselves on top of Jesus, to do something to try to stop all this happening, to scream at the top of their lungs, "Stop this. He doesn't deserve this. He doesn't deserve to have this much pain brought onto somebody who brought nothing but peace with him." All of them felt truly and completely and utterly useless. They'd been with him all this time, and yet none of them knew what to do in this situation. They felt hopeless. And I think we could kind of see why they felt so hopeless, couldn't you? I mean, for the last 3 years of these men's life, 3 years, they'd followed Jesus everywhere that he went. They'd been a part of everything that he had done. They placed all of their hope and their faith in Jesus. They knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that he was the chosen one. He was the Messiah. He's the Christ. But the Messiah is not supposed to die, is he? God wouldn't allow for his chosen one to be treated this way, would he? And yet it was happening. As Jesus walked past them carrying his own cross, being forced to carry the instrument of his own death. His eyes made contact with theirs. His eyes that every time he looked at them with love and compassion and grace, now looked at him in pain, in humiliation, and in exhaustion. As he stumbled, falling under the weight, each and every one of them wanted so badly to just rush over there to help him. But instead, all they could do was turn away, overcome by the emotion and the humiliation that their friend and their teacher and their master was feeling right now. They heard, as his screams were only interrupted by the sound of iron striking iron, as the hammer hit the nail on the top of the head to drive them deeper into hands that only a few hours ago, could it really have only been a few hours ago? These hands washed their feet. As he hung up there, strung up between two guys who likely deserved the fate that they were going through, all while this huge injustice was happening, his disciples felt useless. But for a moment, I want you to try and imagine how Peter must have felt. Peter, at one point in time, was the closest of Jesus' followers. He was there from the very beginning. I mean, he could still clearly remember the very first time that he and Jesus ever interacted. Jesus told him, after he'd been fishing all night, not catching a thing, throw your nets out the other side, and he did, and he caught more fish than he'd ever had in his entire life. And then Jesus, in the midst of this huge windfall of fish, comes up to him and says, now follow me. And he dropped everything. Left it all behind. The biggest payday of his life, he left it behind and followed after Jesus instead. He walked on the water with Jesus. He stood there among the wind and the waves with his friend and his teacher. He'd been on the mountaintop with Jesus as Jesus was somehow talking to Moses and Elijah, guys who'd been dead for centuries. And yet Jesus was there talking to him, and Peter saw this. He saw the whole thing. Peter was the only one of the disciples, the only one who was willing and bold enough that when Jesus asked him, who do you say that I am? Peter said out loud, proudly and proclaimingly, you are the Christ. Who just a few hours ago, just last night, Peter promised him, swore up and down, I'm not ever going to leave your side, even if I'm going to be with you to the end. Jesus, even if it means I have to die, I'm with you. But then that same man, just a little while later, in three of the worst moments of his life, betrayed Jesus on probably the same level as Judas. Because when Jesus needed his friend, when he needed his follower, when he needed that support from Peter most of all, the only words Peter could bring himself to say was, I don't know the man. He denied ever having a relationship with Jesus, the man who meant more to him than anyone else in the world. And Peter said, I don't know him. He felt a tremendous pit in his stomach of guilt and shame, of knowing that after all this was over, his beloved teacher, his best friend, was going to die, believing that Peter had abandoned him. Peter stayed close enough to see what all was going on, and as he's watching all of these events take place, as he's watching everything happen to Jesus that's going on right in front of his eyes, he did the only thing he could think to do in that time, and that's that Peter prayed. He prayed just like Jesus had taught him to in these kinds of moments. He prayed so hard that somehow God would stop this, that God would not allow this injustice to be carried out. Jesus had never even jaywalked, let alone done anything worthy of this. But second by second, as Jesus hung there on that horrible cross, Peter felt a little more of that hope leave. He knew he'd never get the chance. He'd never get the chance to throw his arms around Jesus and tell him how sorry he was and how stupid he felt and how just he wished he'd never done it. He would never get the opportunity to just say he was sorry. Finally, after nearly 6 hours, Peter heard him say it. Peter heard what we read in John 19, verse 30. It says, when Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, "It is finished." And then bowing his head, he gave up his spirit. It was over. He wasn't suffering anymore, but Peter couldn't help but marvel at the notion that in just one passing moment, Jesus went from alive to dead. And Peter probably thought what a lot of us think in these kinds of moments. He probably had the same thoughts that you and I have had when somebody close to us passes away. He had those thoughts that maybe it's not real. Maybe they just made a mistake. Maybe he's still alive. But that hope was taken away as he watched as the soldiers ran a spear through the side of Jesus and he saw the blood and the water pool from his body. He was really gone. Peter heard that a man by the name of Joseph, a guy from Arimathea, had offered up a tomb that he had bought for himself for them to be able to bury Jesus. And that actually Joseph had gone and gotten permission from Pilate, whose name was quickly becoming a curse word in Peter's vocabulary. Got permission to bury Jesus, but Peter knew they had to hurry. See, because the next day is the Sabbath, and the law is very strict on what you can and can't do on the Sabbath, and unfortunately, burying your best friend who was killed for something he didn't do, well, that's just not on the list of things that can happen. Peter was so irritated by the injustice of all of this that even though Jesus had died for something he did not do, they couldn't even have the audacity to give them a proper burial. Instead, they'd have to rush. And as they rolled the stone in front of that tomb, Peter felt angry. He felt frustration. But above everything else, he felt that guilt. The next day, you have to imagine, was something of a fog. Peter didn't sleep well that night, if he slept at all. Most of the disciples got back together, including Peter. They all found themselves under the same roof, but none of them knew what to do with themselves. None of them knew what to say, so they just stared at each other through tear-stained eyes, wondering, how did the last 2 days happen? It started with them planning on a Passover meal and having dinner with their best friend, and it ended with them putting that same person in a grave, in a borrowed tomb. How in the world did we get here? After a few hours of staying silent with each other, I imagine the disciples probably did what you and I would do in those kinds of times. They began to reminisce. They started telling stories, swapping stories about Jesus and their time together with him. And some of the stories were stories that everybody in the room knew. They'd been there, they'd witnessed it themselves. Some of them were more personal. It happened on a more individual level. They learned just what Jesus had really done for all of them. They laughed. They cried more. But the entire time, Peter just stayed quiet. The disciples did everything they could to try to encourage him to start sharing with them, to begin to heal those wounds with them. But he couldn't do it. Because now every single memory he had of Jesus was tainted. It was tainted by the guilt that he felt. for that dumb mistake that he made. Isn't it amazing how so much of our lives can change and be ruined by just one moment of stupidity? We make one choice that we shouldn't have made, and it ruins so much of our lives. Peter felt that weight. They got word that the chief priests had somehow convinced Pilate, the coward, to post guards at the tomb of Jesus. What did they think was going to happen? How could these guys not even just let Jesus rest in peace? I mean, they're the reason he's in there in the first place. Why can't you just leave him alone? What more could he possibly do to them? But at the end of the day, Peter knew it didn't matter because none of it was going to bring Jesus back. He felt numb. He was just kind of floating through the rest of his time. Peter heard that some of the women in the group had decided that the next morning they were going to go and they were going to do what they could to give Jesus a better burial. They were going to go and try to do some of the things that they couldn't do because of the Sabbath. They were going to go and they were going to try to do whatever they could. And Peter couldn't help but chuckle at the thought, because how could they possibly think they were going to get that to happen? I mean, there was no way they were going to get the stone rolled away. And even if they could, if the guards are there, they're going to stop them. And if they break the seal of Pilate, then they're going to be arrested themselves. But he understood that they felt like they had to do something. And this was at least something. The next morning, Peter sat there with his friend John. The two disciples just did the same thing. They just stared at each other. Neither of them knowing what to say. These two were probably closer to Jesus than any of the other 11. They'd been there, went through all of the thick and thin. Anytime that Jesus ever took just a portion of the disciples, Peter and John were among those. But as they sat there staring at each other, they heard the sound of rushing feet, and the door burst open. And Mary Magdalene, one of the women who had gone to the tomb that morning, was standing there. Her eyes were panicked. She was out of breath. It was clear that she'd been sprinting this entire time, and she somehow managed to utter the words that we see in the end of John 20, verse 2. She said, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they've put him." You can kind of see it for that moment as Peter and John look at her, and then they look at each other. It doesn't dawn on them what she just said, and then all of a sudden it just clicks. And they both rush out of the room, and we see what happens in the rest of the verses 3 and 4. It says that at that, Peter and the other disciple, which is John talking about himself, they went out, heading for the tomb. The two of them were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter and got to the tomb first. If it's okay with you, I want to press pause right now, because I want to point out something about this particular passage that's always kind of bugged me, something that's always kind of stood out to me. All right, this is a pretty heavy emotional time, right? You're probably feeling a little bit emotional yourself right now. Am I wrong? Okay, this is John recounting this time. We know how this story is going to play out. You and I know exactly how this is going to go down, or at the very least, most of us know what's going to happen next, and yet John does not know that in this particular moment. And yet, for some reason, John decides to break up this hugely emotional, heavy moment for him and his friend Peter to let us know that when the two of them ran to Jesus' tomb, John won the race. Seems like a really weird time to me to flex, but I guess if you're the one who's recounting your own testimony of what happened, you can put in whatever facts you think are important. And John felt we needed to know, I'm the fastest disciple. But the two ran into the tomb and they discovered it was in fact empty. And a million questions begin running through Peter's mind. They just rush at him all at once like a flood. What happened to his body? Where did they take it? Why would they take it? Was this the chief priest? Why would they do something like this? Why would anybody want to do this? Why would they want to take a dead body out of its tomb? How did they get the stone moved? Why would they go through all this trouble? Why would they fold up the cloths? Why would they place them neatly there? But probably the question on the forefront, the question that drove through everything else that Peter had going through his mind that moment was, what does this mean? What does this mean? And he didn't know what else to do. John didn't know what else to do in that moment either, and so the two of them just went back to the house that they stayed at. I mean, there's nothing they can do right now. So they went back, but Mary decided to hang there for a little while longer, to cry, sobbing in confusion and in pain. Peter and John weren't back at the house much longer. They had barely gotten sat back down when they heard the footsteps again. And the door burst open one more time, and it was Mary again, and she was out of breath. She'd clearly sprinted yet again to be here. But her eyes were different. Yeah, she was crying like she'd been, but there was something different about these tears. And there was a smile across her face that they didn't understand. It's the first real smile any of them had seen in the last 3 days. And she says what we see in the middle of verse 18. She says the words, "I have seen the Lord." I've seen him. He's alive. She began to tell them about being at the tomb and how she's just sitting there, just a complete emotional wreck, just sobbing to where there's mud on the ground beneath her. And an angel appeared before her and said, what are you doing here? Why are you here? And then she talked about how she at first didn't recognize Jesus. She thought it was the gardener. And it wasn't until he said her name, Mary, that it clicked. It was him. Somehow, some way it was him. And she told them that Jesus himself told her, "Go and tell my friends." Peter couldn't believe what he was hearing. I mean, could this possibly be true? For the first time, Peter began to feel hope that he had felt as Jesus hung on the cross, that feigning hope had suddenly welled up within him. He couldn't help but smile at the thought that maybe in fact my friend is alive. And no sooner than he felt that hope and that joy, then all of a sudden that shroud went over him again, that shroud of guilt and weight. Because if it is true and Jesus is alive, well, he probably doesn't want to see me. I'm probably the last of the people that Jesus wants to be around because he knew. I mean, for crying out loud, Jesus told me I was going to betray him. He knew it had happened. Peter knew that even if Jesus did come around Peter, it wasn't going to be like it was. They weren't going to be as tightly knit together as they'd been. Jesus might even banish Peter. He certainly felt like he deserved it. That evening, as word began to spread amongst the rest of Jesus' followers that he was in fact alive, that he was not as dead as they all thought he might be, most of the remaining disciples, really everybody but Thomas, got back together and they decided to enter into this room, and they probably got together to discuss what all this might mean. As the last of them came into the room, they went ahead and they locked the door because they're still pretty smart guys, and they thought maybe this is all just an elaborate plan against us. Maybe the chief priests and the other religious leaders, they're just using this as an opportunity to get us all together so they can just arrest us all at once. And so they locked the door behind them. But as they began their discussion, they soon realized, we're not alone in here. We see what happens in the last part of verse 19. It says that Jesus came stood among them and said to them, "Peace be with you." They were shocked. I mean, how could you not be, right? You were in a room that you thought was locked, that nobody else was in, and all of a sudden, poof, "Hey guys, what's up?" That's going to weird you out. But there he was, standing right there among them, like he'd never gone. He had a couple holes in his hands and a couple in his feet, and had this nagging thing in his side. But he was there. He was alive. I'm going to guess that at least one of them probably had the thought that this is a ghost. I mean, we know that whenever Jesus was walking on the water, that was the first thought that some of them had: it's a ghost. But Jesus proved to them, no, I'm real. You can touch the sores if you want to. Out of curiosity, who's going to want to do that? Right? Like that's weird. But he ate with them, and I don't know about you, but I don't know any ghosts that eat. He hung out with them. He talked with them. They shared an evening together. It was him. It was really him. Peter couldn't believe his own eyes. There was Jesus alive. But as happy as he was to see Jesus there, Peter didn't exactly come right up to Jesus. He didn't come up to him. He didn't say much to Jesus. If anything, he was a little sheepish around him. Here it was, an opportunity for him to get that apology that he wanted so badly to give Jesus as he was on the cross, and now Jesus is here in front of him, and I just can't. And we know that he had other opportunities, because about a week after this, Jesus came again. Again, they were in a locked room, and Jesus showed up, but Peter still didn't go up to him. Still didn't say anything to Jesus. Didn't go out of his way to get a moment with him. But not long after all this, Peter and a few of his disciples, they decide, let's go fishing. I don't know what it is, but for some reason it feels like right now is the perfect opportunity for us to go and do a little fishing. And so they go out in the middle of the night, and they do this thing that Peter had done all his life, to go fishing. They fished from dusk until dawn. But as the morning light came over the hills, they hadn't caught anything. It's kind of one of those nights, I suppose. As the light began to grow, they looked out onto the shore, and they saw something that they weren't quite expecting. Some dude was hanging out on the shore. And he called out to them and said, "Hey, did you guys catch anything?" "Thanks for rubbing it in, bro." He said, "That's okay. Toss your nets out the other side. You'll find something there." Peter couldn't quite explain it. Man, there was something familiar here. So he did. And wouldn't you know it, the nets were too full to even pull back onto the boat. And in an instant, Peter remembered exactly what was going on here. He knew why this moment felt so familiar to him, because it's just like when he first met Jesus. In his excitement, Peter didn't even wait for the boat to get to the shore. He hopped off the edge of it, and he just started swimming straight for Jesus. It's a really cool and touching moment, but as we find out in verse 8, or John 21, verse 8, it tells us that it was probably a little unnecessary. It says since they weren't that far from land, only about 100 yards, the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish. Again, nice moment, Pete, but you kind of got wet for nothing here, bud. Jesus took some of the fish that they had caught, and he fixed them breakfast with it. As they all sat around the fire to eat, Peter probably sitting a little closer to the fire than everybody else. He's got to dry off here. Jesus just came and sat right next to him. You know that moment that you have whenever you know that somebody's mad at you, and then they come and stand right next to you or sit right next to you, just that Like you feel all of your nerve endings go off at once. You want so badly to just run away, but you know that that isn't going to solve anything. Yeah, Peter felt that. He knew, I need to apologize. I need to make this right. I need to take this opportunity because Jesus hadn't been around him every day like he'd been beforehand. He just kind of popped up sporadically, and so Peter knew I need to take advantage of this moment, but he just couldn't find the words to say. But that's okay, because Jesus decided to speak up first. We see it in verse 15. When Jesus says his first words, it's got to be like a dagger right into Peter's gut. He says, Simon, he's using the real name, not the nickname. You know he's serious. Son of John, do you love me? That hurt. Peter could feel the tears begin to well up in his eyes. And his voice cracked as he said, yes, Lord. You know that I love you. And for some reason, the only response that Jesus offered to him was, well, feed my lambs. Okay. It's just kind of quiet. But the conversation's not over. Jesus says to him again, a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? This time Peter can't stop him. His tears start rolling off his cheek. He starts getting that real mucusy cry, you know what I'm talking about? Like when you just lose all function and capabilities of holding back. He could barely get it out this time. He says, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And once more Peter says something, or Jesus says something that's a little unusual. He says, shepherd my sheep. Peter is at this point in so much pain. He's just hoping that that's it, that it's over. But it's not. A final time, Jesus asks him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter breaks. He loses it. It's too much. This is too much for him to bear in this particular moment. And he says to Jesus, Lord, you know everything. You know everything. You know that I love you. He barely gets the words out, and Jesus tells him, then feed my sheep. And Jesus goes on to talk to Peter, and he begins to tell him this unusual thing, and it's kind of that thing that Jesus did from time to time where he talks about something that hasn't happened yet, but he's clearly telling us something that's going to take place, but he's awfully vague. But when he finishes this really weird conversation between the two of them, he says the words that Peter thought he'd never hear Jesus say again, the words that he never thought he would ever get to hear come out of the mouth of his Lord and his Savior. Follow me. That was it. That was the moment. Peter just knew at that particular moment they were back together. And not that Peter had to keep his distance, but they could have that connection again, that same friendship that they'd had before the cross, before Peter denied him 3 times. Wait, 3 times? How many times did Jesus ask him, do you love me? I see what you did there. He gave Peter the opportunity to express his love for him. After he denied him 3 times, Peter got exactly that many opportunities to proclaim his faith. You'll notice in that whole conversation, at no point in time does Peter ever say, I'm sorry. And yet, Jesus forgave him anyway. And that's really the hope of Easter, is it not? Because of the death and the resurrection of Jesus, we can be restored to him. Peter did absolutely nothing to deserve this restoration. If anything, he gave Jesus 3 examples of why he is unworthy to follow after him. I don't know about you, but I've given Jesus a lot more than 3 examples of why I am unworthy of him. And yet, because of today, because of what this day means, in spite of my sin, in spite of my shame, and in spite of my guilt, Jesus still offers for me to follow him. And he offers that to you too. I don't claim to know where anybody in this room is spiritually. I don't claim to know where anybody is with Jesus in this time period. And some of you may be feeling that weight of guilt, of the things that you know you've done wrong, the things that you know you've done that have gone against God, the things that you hope nobody else around you knows. But you know that weight. Jesus is still offering out his hand to you, saying, follow me. You can't earn it. You don't deserve it. He gives it to you anyway. Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9 say, for you are saved by grace through faith. This is not of yourselves, it is God's gift, not from works, so that no one can boast.